Maybe there's some privacy preserving technologies that we can use that allow us to do some of the things that we did, but in different ways and with less data sharing. And that's going to open back up. But in order for that to open back up, there needs to be someone in the organization who's making a decision.
Hey gang, it's Thursday, April 29th. Steve and listeners, welcome to the Behind the Numbers Daily, an eMarketer podcast made possible by Neustar. I am not your usual host, Marcus Johnson. I am Nicole Perrin, principal analyst, and I am joined by Steve Silvers, who's SVP Product and GM Customer Experience at Neustar. Hi, Steve. How's it going?
Good. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to chat, and we're going to be talking about a bunch of stuff that's roiling the advertising ecosystem these days, including cookies, including the identity crisis. I know it's everyone's favorite topic. And believe me, I spend not just all of my work time, but all of my time thinking about these things at this point. So Steve, let's get into it. What are some common misconceptions or oversights that you see marketers making these days about cookies and ID deprecation?
So I think there are two big misconceptions and mistakes that marketers are making. One of them, I think, may finally be getting solved. You know, when we started this evolution a few years ago, when Safari started blocking third-party cookies, which feels like it was a million years ago now, but I think it was more like 3 or 4.
Yeah, it feels like it was a long time.
Long time ago. There was really a perception on the marketing side that marketers really thought this is an ad tech problem. This is your problem. This is not our problem. It's your problem to fix. And that, particularly with the changes that Apple is making, it has changed. And I think that's a good change because this ID deprecation issue is a problem that we have to solve together, right? And brands need to take ownership and responsibility for, their data strategy, their privacy policy, what data they'll use and how they'll use it. Like they can't really outsource that anymore. It's too important. And so I am starting to see organizations start to mature there, particularly because of the IDFA change, which really affects everybody very clearly. And so that's been really good, but we still need more of that. We, as an industry, as a profession, we need to kind of grow up and take ownership of that directly. So that's thing number one. The other thing that I think that people are doing, which I think is a mistake, is I think we all have all of our eggs in the identified solution basket. And I think that is a mistake. And that is because, this new world that we're going into definitely creates have and have not. There are some, publishers, platforms, brands, they get a lot of consumers to come to their properties and log in, and they have a lot of really good data there. But most sites and apps, they actually don't have that. And when we started this process, we really thought that there'd be this groundswell where more and more websites would actually start putting up some sort of login wall where you really couldn't get access to content if you didn't log in. And obviously some publishers, big names like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, those folks have done that and been successful, but we haven't seen that happen on most websites. And so a lot of the assumptions that we're making about, authenticated solutions is that we're going to get something like 30% of consumers to log in. I think that's the number that I've heard bandied about.
Yeah.
And we're just not seeing anywhere near that. If you look at it today on average, now, they're obviously outliers, but on average, you're seeing maybe 3 to 5% of consumers log in. And so if we're expecting that to be the only thing as marketers that we have to do, then we are going to end up being disappointed because you're just not going to be able to get the eyeballs that you're used to and spend the dollars that you've been used to spending that way. You're going to have a variety of methods. And what's going to be challenging there is that most of the solutions that you see out there are, well, most of what we're talking about are identified solutions. And we have one too, which everyone has one. But we don't see anything out in the market that really is trying to solve that problem holistically. So we're seeing a lot of point solutions.
Right.
And that's going to be really challenging for marketers that we've been working for years on this, single dashboard, single audience building concept where we've all wanted to go to this place where I build my audience once and then I push it out everywhere and I don't have to do it in these different platforms and these different channels. But if we're not careful and we're not thinking ahead, either we're not going to be able to spend the money that we used to spend and get the eyeballs that we're used to, or B, we're going to have to log into like 10 different platforms and we're going to have to build the audience 10 different ways. And then we're going to struggle to measure back how effective those audiences were in terms of, getting the reach we wanted and driving the ROI. And so this becomes a very disjointed experience, or you're only hitting 20% of the people you used to hit. So both of those are bad. Obviously, the 20% reach problem is the bigger problem. But as a marketer, you're going to have to solve for both. And I just don't think that people are really talking about that yet. It's very weird.
Yeah, no, I think so. Those are both good points. And just to kind of recap, the first thing that you said, which is that years ago, brands kind of felt like they had the ability or maybe the luxury to say, like, this is an ad tech problem, you solve this. And I think like one of the things that's probably really changed how brands think about that is the rise of regulation and consumer concern about what they're doing with data. They've realized they do have to take more responsibility for what happens in digital advertising. And it's not just kind of all down to, whatever the vendors can enable, right? But to your second point, which is about like, most of the audience is not going to be authenticated, and you're not going to be able to just rely on one thing, not just one solution, but even one type of solution. You're going to really have to get creative with both executing and then measuring and making sense of campaigns that involve everything from, deterministic one-to-one targeting to things that only have aggregate reporting and were only ever based on totally probabilistic signals, right? And I do think that how advertisers put that together, I'm not hearing a lot of people talking about that yet.
No, and it's really surprising. And I can't figure out if it's, that people really have their collective head in the sand, or do we all just figure, well, we used to do contextual 10 years ago, so we'll just go back to doing that and we know how to do that. I mean, maybe that's the case, but it's going to be more challenging to put the pieces together, but there are some really great options. And so I think that, as things develop and, Chrome's doing their Flock origin trials now. And so we're actually finally getting to see the privacy sandbox in the wild. There's a lot of really cool things being done with contextual targeting, and the IB Tech Lab has been working on getting standards together there so that we can have a consistent way to have that data come through. And combining the solutions is actually really cool, because if you think about it, and again, some of this depends on how much authenticated traffic you can get, but if you can get enough overlap between the login events, the logged in users, and these other less one-to-one solutions, you can use those overlaps to project both in terms of like reach extension, but also measurement and performance into those channels. So it's actually like having a combined solution, it ends up being really compelling once you think it all the way through, because now, you can't do exactly what you were doing before, but at least you can use the overlaps between the solutions to build a more holistic audience plan than you would otherwise. And frankly, it might actually be better than what you're doing today, because there are no cookies on Safari. There are no cookies in Firefox. Yes, Chrome is a big, 60-something% of the market. So it's the big 100-pound gorilla in the room. But there's a lot of people that you're targeting badly or not at all with the solutions that you have out in the market. And being able to do something with contextual or Privacy Sandbox or combine those things, it might actually be better. So that could be really cool. Now, we haven't seen Safari or Firefox embrace the Privacy Sandbox paradigm yet. And I don't know that we're going to, particularly with the concerns that even Google seems to have in Europe about the viability of the Privacy Sandbox. So maybe that won't happen. But contextual is a thing and it's real and it's going to work because it's just the way that we used to buy media. And so in my mind, as a marketer, I want to start thinking about, like, I'm not going to be able to get to 100% of my media, but how close to 100 can I get and how easy can I make it so that I have my audience of whatever it is. I like tacos. I usually talk about my taco lover segment. If I got my taco lover segment and I've got to build it and I got to execute it across multiple channels and even in the digital channels where I used to think everything was addressable, now it's not. How do I get a holistic segment out there and then bring all the data back in and measure it in one place, right? And so I don't think there's enough focus on that yet. We're, at Neustar, we're really trying to change that. Mm-hmm. We're working very diligently on these non-identified solutions, but in the context of including the identified solutions and the non-identified solutions together in a more of a holistic whole. And I'm hoping that more people start getting excited about that because we're very excited about it.
Yeah, we're going to be back in just a moment. But first, just a quick message about our sponsor. There's so much happening in marketing these days, but let's be honest, a lot of it is hype. Join Allison Dietz and Devin de Blasio, the hosts of No Hype, a podcast about truth, science, and the future of marketing, as they cut through the noise and get to what you really need to know. Please share, subscribe, and enjoy the ride at nohype.neustar. That's nohype.neustar. Cool. And now I'm back. So let's talk a little bit about, some of the things that marketers should be doing now. So they've got, maybe the rest of this year and a little more to prepare for the loss of the cookie, which will come in early 2022. And, just this week, we've seen the update to iOS 14.5, which changes the rules for how you can do cross-app tracking with or without the IDFA. What should marketers be doing now to prepare for the changes that haven't happened yet and deal with the ones that have already come?
So what we've seen, and again, this has been a really interesting evolution, is, like I said earlier, marketers were kind of outsourcing the decision. The problem is not theirs. We've seen a lot of marketers over the last few months really start to take the ID deprecation seriously, very specifically because of the Apple change, because the Apple change is very far reaching. It's very confusing. I sometimes wish that we had actually had legislation in the US about this because it would be easier to know how things should work than it is from the Apple documentation, because it's just all of us looking at this developer page and trying to figure out what it is they intend. So we've seen people be very, very conservative, which I think is good. I think that most of the reason that we're seeing marketers be very conservative about the Apple change is because they actually don't have the internal processes in place to make a more nuanced decision. And so they're just making the easiest decision they can do, which is just stopping. So, my expectation is, and I've been living in this world for a while because I've opted out of advertising on my iPhone for a while. And so I see really bad ads all the time. And so now everyone probably, and I don't know how many of you have opted in or not, probably all seeing really bad ads now. And I'm suspecting that's going to change, because what's going to happen here is that the brands are actually going to put, and they're going to have to put, the infrastructure in place internally in terms of staff and people and to make the decisions. Every brand I've talked to over the last 6 months, and I asked them who's making the decision about what you're doing with the IDFA, and no one's been able to give me a name. So not a single brand has been able to say, this is the person who's making the decision. And so that's pretty telling, right? So obviously there's a brand impact on whether you ask for tracking or not, right? There's some brands that probably should be making, do we want to be a brand that's asking if you can track or not in your own app, right? This is just first party app tracking. Do you make that decision or not? If you do make the decision, what does that mean? And how are you going to continue to use your first party data for marketing? What is the nuance there? Like, is there nuance about stuff that you collect in app, not in app, on Apple devices, not Apple devices, like all that, like kind of like data governance? Like there's nothing, like there's no one in most organizations that is building out like a policy.
That makes it, it makes it sound to me also like these organizations, they don't understand kind of how far reaching some of these changes are.
Yeah, I think it was really a surprise. When Apple first announced the changes, like most of the brands I talked to, like they didn't think it was their problem.
It's like, it's some technical advertising thing. People's eyes glaze over when you start talking about programmatic. They're like, whatever, I don't, bidding, I can't understand that.
Yeah.
But it's way deeper than that.
It is. And now I've seen things swing the other direction where everything's being shut off. No one's doing anything. Like it's all being shut down. And, I think over the next couple months, people are going to realize that maybe that was an overreaction and that maybe we can dial things up a little bit and use some of this data in some ways or not in others. Maybe there's some privacy preserving technologies that we can use that allow us to do some of the things that we did, but in different ways and with less data sharing. Mm-hmm. And that's going to open back up. But in order for that to open back up, there needs to be someone in the organization who's making a decision. And so my expectation is, and certainly as we get closer to the cookie apocalypse early next year, companies need like data officers that are specifically responsible for figuring out what to operationalize and what to keep safe and how to do it. And it's not really privacy. It's not really technology. It's not really marketing. It's something that has to sit in between those things and almost be an independent entity. And so we certainly see, I've seen that organizations that have already made that change, you see folks that have like a chief data officer or something like that. Like they are further along in this transformation than the ones that are not.
Yep.
And those companies are already building out their data strategy, their data governance, and then they're pushing that forward. And then we already have a lot of technology, privacy preserving technology that can help with the sharing, not sharing problem that we have now. But most marketers don't know that they need it because the world hasn't really changed yet. And so it's hard because, we talk about things like clean rooms and secure multi-party computing. And we're like, hey, next year, you're really going to need this thing.
I promise you will be doing this next year.
Yeah. Right? And so next year, like when, and I'm hoping this accelerates now with the Apple change and people realize what a big deal this is. And I'm hoping we move that into this year where people are like, oh, wow, I really do need that thing. Mm-hmm. And we really need the people in the organization that are going to make that decision. So it's a transformation that's happening. And the more as marketers we can push our organizations to make those changes, I think the better off we all are because, we talk about this a lot. We do a lot of stuff. We talk about one-to-one a lot. There are some cases where one-to-one really makes a difference, but most of the time it actually doesn't. And most of the time that we're talking about one-to-one, we're really not doing one-to-one. Like we're actually building segments, except when, those shoes that you looked at on the website that follow you around that everyone hates, like other than like those use cases, it's almost never one-to-one. Yeah. So, when Chrome came out and said that they tested flocks and they were 95% as effective as cookies, and everyone was like, well, where'd you get that number? How'd you do that? Methodology aside, most of us have been using some form of segmentation or cohorts in our advertising forever, right? So, you build a propensity model and there are a whole bunch of people in that propensity model, and you don't really need to know that it's Joe and Bob and Sue, and you don't need to know who's in that propensity model as long as you have a propensity model and you're able to operate on it and you're able to drive your ROI. Who cares that Joey's in there? It shouldn't matter.
Yeah, no, completely. That's completely right. Of course. Yeah. And, to your point about organizations with whether it's a data officer or some other kind of decision maker, One thing that I've been saying recently about this and confronting these identity changes is that you really do need to have a data strategy. And that does not just mean like collect all the first party data I can. It means thinking about like, what are we as an organization comfortable with? What do we think needs to be consented opt-in? What are we comfortable with just having as opt-out? How are we comfortable using that information? Do we think that we're, providing a good value exchange to our customers by doing these things? And only if you've answered questions like that can you make decisions about which quote unquote cookie alternatives am I going to use? It's all based on your actual philosophy of what you think is okay.
Right. And then actually, once you've done that, it actually opens up all sorts of interesting data partnership opportunities. Because
Totally.
now you know what you have and you know how you're comfortable using it and you know what you don't have, right? And so if there's another company, that you work with in another capacity, or maybe you don't, like maybe it's a media exchange, maybe, you put the soda in their machine or whatever it is, like there are data sharing opportunities once you've done the work to figure out what you have and what you need. And now, with these new privacy preserving technologies like the clean room, you can share them in a safe way to power the use cases that are really, really relevant and important to you and your partners without necessarily having the data move around a lot.
Yep.
But, you need to know what you have and what you need so then you can know what you can get. And then now you can really drive like interesting ROI opportunities and partnerships because you've done that work. And, most brands haven't done that yet. And so it will be a really after we get out over the shock of this, and it is going to be a shock. And I think the next month or two are going to be a little upsetting. Once we get over the shock of this and then we can get past it, I think that the world actually becomes a cooler place for data partnerships and marketing than it's ever been before. Because, just from bright side, like you've specifically asked on iOS the permission to track these users, whatever percentage you get. And I haven't seen any numbers yet, so I don't know what the percentages are, but you've actually asked and now you have that permission. So, that's a really strong signal that you can use that data, right? So, you have less data than you had before, but the people who have opted in, there's no ambiguity there. And so that means that you can use that data in interesting ways. And I think people will. And I think that a lot of the privacy preserving technologies that we're talking about are really going to help. And I think partnerships between companies are going to be really key. So, today we have this big programmatic ecosystem that spews out all of this data with identifiers on it. And that's really the primary source that drives all of the data and segmentation. And that's going to be smaller because, we're only getting 3 to 5% of people logging in, right? So data partnerships are going to be really, really important. And as a brand, you're going to have to be thinking, again, here's what I have. Here's what I need. Here's where I can get it. What's the value exchange between me and my customers? What's the value exchange between me and my partners? What can I do and how can I do that to drive ROI? But with privacy preserving technologies and clear consent, I can do more with the data than I could 2 years ago. So I may have a little less data, but I can do a lot more with it. It's actually a lot more powerful. And so I think once we get past the shock, I think we start, I think we've had our heads in the sand for a little bit. And so I think the shock is going to be pretty bad. There's a lot of really cool things that we can be doing. And I'm hoping, and I'm actually excited and looking forward to that, because I think that's going to be a really fun time with really cool new challenges. And, we're going to have to do things differently. We're going to have to build a lot of cool products, which I love doing, new problems to solve. But that's why we're all in this business, is because we love solving those problems.
Yeah, well, and I can tell you sound very excited about it. So let's talk a little bit about how Neustar is solving them. So what's Fabric and how is it different from some of the other cookie replacement solutions in market?
Well, I think the fundamental thing about Fabric is that Fabric is our customer identity platform. And it's not just about replacing cookies, right? It is not a new synthetic ID, right? So we have a new synthetic ID. It's called the Fabric ID. but it's not the only thing that we're doing. And it's not the only thing that's relevant. Fabric is about connectivity and privacy. And it's open, right? So as Fabric, we are supporting a multitude of IDs. We're not just supporting our own. So we support LiveRamp's ID. We support the UID2, which I don't know if it still belongs to the trade desk or is really open source yet.
I think it's open source now. Yeah.
I think it is, but I'm not sure. So we'll find out. But we're going to support those IDs. We're looking at the ecosystem and we're looking at other IDs that seem relevant that we want to support. We think it's a small part of ad spend, but we think it's a really critical part. And so we definitely want to make sure that we're there. But Fabric also includes direct integrations with a lot of big platforms. We use a lot of privacy preserving technologies to be able to measure walled gardens into our measurement solutions where we don't get access to raw data. And that's going to continue and grow. We're going to have to come up with more and more creative ways to leverage clean rooms in other ways than the user sets that we're currently doing. But that's going to grow. It's very cool. And then also Fabric includes the contextual data and targeting. So you can build an audience and you can target across multiple channels. And once we get past the trial stage for the flocks, it will include those as well. And so it is intended to be the holistic solution that the market needs and not a point solution. And so, unfortunately, that makes it slightly harder to describe because it's not just a double salted hashed email thing that just sounds really easy. And so it's a little more complicated than that, but it does have the double salted hashed thing in there too, because it's important. You're going to need that. So we're looking at this long term and we're looking at the organization. And as I mentioned before, as brands mature and they get these data officers and they're building their data strategies, this type of holistic solution like Fabric becomes more and more important. And so we often partner with our clients as sort of, change agents with them to help them reshift their organization. We do data strategy sessions with them, data assessments to figure out what they have in their fabric, what they need, who's making the decisions, and then growing that sort of data strategy and building partnerships using privacy preserving technologies and, our identity assets to help. But those partnerships are really driven by the companies themselves, right? So they're direct partnerships and we just facilitate them.
Cool, Steve. So yeah, just final question for you. You've talked about, partnerships, educating these brands. Anything in particular that you're really wanting to kind of advise marketers as, the last thing to let them know as part of this episode?
Sure. I think that if you're not thinking about privacy preserving technologies in your organization at this time, you are making a mistake. And it's not clear to we have some brands that are really, really focused on it. And most of them are in highly regulated industries. And frankly, most of them have been breached. And so they're particularly sensitive to it. But the world is moving to a place where your data, you're not going to want your data to move around as much as it is before. So we see it all the time. There are these breaches and they're not even like hacks. There's like someone made a mistake and they left a file on a file share someplace. And all of a sudden, like it's been found and now you've got a breach. And so it's not even malicious. It's just mistakes. And the more data moves, the more mistakes that
we're human.
Right.
We're human. It's not all done by machines.
So the future state in 3 years, maybe 2, is these clean rooms that facilitate secure multi-party computing where you're able to run algorithms across multiple people's data stores without the data moving around. So if I want to run a lift study against like 3 different partners' data with my sales data, I send the algorithm out and they run the algorithm and they send me the results. That I don't get the raw data. I don't get access to raw data, but I get the insight. And that's all that matters. Like we have to quickly move to that model. And the more we get actual privacy legislation, the quicker that's going to happen. So as a marketer, you should be thinking about that. We'd love you to think of us, but you should be thinking of that anyway. So if you're not and you want to talk about it, you should give me a call.
Yep. Sounds good. And that's all that we have time for. So thank you, Steve.
Thanks a lot. This is awesome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know if people thought I was kidding that I just love talking about this all the time, but I think it's obvious that we were not kidding. So thank you to everyone listening. Marcus, will see you tomorrow for the Behind the Numbers Weekly Listen and eMarketer podcast, which is made possible by Neustar. Thanks.